Yeah. And chair, we have Professor Pablo Barroso. I want to introduce you briefly, Professor Pablo Barroso. Professor Barroso is associate professor in Boston College Law School. He received as SJD from Harvard Law School and a PhD in political science from Rio de Janeiro University Research Institute. Before joining Boston College Law School, he was lecturer in social thought at Harvard University, where he was the first recipient of the Stanley Hoffman Prize for Excellence in Teaching. Professor Barroso is from Brazil and is one of the great Latin American faculty in Boston College. So thank you so much, Professor Barroso, for joining us. And thank you, both of you, for being here for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to take part in the conference. I would like to start by recognizing the leadership of the Clough Center and of the Graduate International Studies program at the Law School for their leadership in bringing the inter-American system closer to the university. We had here early this month the Chief Justice Ferry McGregor of the court, and we are now delighted to have Ms. Brenda Santa Maria with us here. And I'm also delighted to recognize the leadership of Professor Rosa that conceived of and brought together this very timely conference. Ms. Brenda Santa Maria is the chief of the Electoral Observation Section of the Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation, the Organização dos Estados Americanos. She will speak for about 25 minutes, and we will open for questions. So without further ado, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for the Clough Center for Studies of Constitutional Democracies, for the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, and also for the University of UNAM, UNAM Boston. They have a center here. Thank you for that. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share with all of you what we do every day. Electoral observation missions, as I was mentioning to some of you, are our everyday and common day work, but not everybody knows what the OAS has been doing for the past more than 56 years all over the region. We've observed in 28 countries that are member states. Some of them are new, like Brazil. We just deployed an electoral observation mission for the first time in our history. Some countries stopped inviting the OAS, and that happened years ago with some of them. One of our key mandates at the organization is to support the effective exercise of representative democracy. What we do, in few words, in an EOM is we deploy a number of experts and observers. We analyze how the electoral process and the system works, and then we make recommendations to help improve. What Dr. Pipanaris presented as a study was great for us. It was a great tool because she discovered with other professors that OAS recommendations are implemented in more than 50% in a range of time of 4 years, which is really satisfying because it's a difficult program to hold accountability. What happens, what changes in 34 countries in the region, in 28 that we observe. So at the Department of Electoral Cooperation, we have a very comprehensive view of what is happening in the region. But it is true that some countries still struggle with basic processes such as preparing voter lists, candidate registration, the training of poll workers. There are other countries that have overcome that. And that are facing new challenges. We call them sometimes second tiers of challenges that include more aspects like participation of women, electoral violence against women, the impact of public and private money in elections, government interventions in political processes, the effect of social media, the media and internet, and even playing fields. As democracies have matured, so did our missions. These missions don't look the same like they did 56 years ago. So now we have this big number of experts that we deploy, and they prepare very professional and standardized reports that allow us to have this comprehensive view of elections. In this 2018, we've already deployed 12 missions around the region. We started with a referendum in Ecuador at the beginning of the year, and the same day elections in Costa Rica. We observed the second round of elections, the presidential election in Costa Rica. We also observed local elections and legislative in El Salvador in March, Grenada. In Colombia, they had 3 different elections through the year, and they elected legislators as president, and they had also 2 rounds, so we were present in 3 different periods of time in Colombia. We also observed elections, general elections in Paraguay. In July 1st, we observed the biggest elections in history in Mexico, which was a very interesting experience, and for the first time, as I mentioned, Brazil, which, if we have the opportunity and the means, we will probably be observing the referendum in Peru, which is soon. It was just called, and that's why I'm saying probably. It's too short time, but hopefully we can be there for December 9th when they are making very important decisions for the system. As Dr. Norris mentioned it, clearly there's some disenchantment, and I guess everybody that it's here have the figures and the numbers of how, confidence and trust in democracy and how strong it is. It's going down, and it's difficult for us that we work so hard every day to make it better. But that's the context in which our elections took place this year. So reports of EOM missions reflect this trend that has been taking place in the region, that electoral authorities are organizing better elections with greater levels of professionalism. This does not mean that elections are perfect, or that there are no mistakes, or there is no irregularities. All electoral processes have them, and there's always room of improvement. Even countries that in the integrity index are at the very top have areas that need to be improved. So it's not about, in our case, we observe our member states and we look at them always as we are a tool for them to improve their systems. I will start talking about what happened with electoral norms, because this is an issue that permeates every other area of the electoral process and of the electoral institution. And there's an ample variety of electoral regulations in the region. Some countries have very strong systems, very clear rules, and some other have weaker frameworks, which not only complicate the situation for the electoral authority, but for the political parties, for the media, and for civil society too. For example, lately in Brazil, there was a change in the legislation in 2015, and they shortened the period to present claims to candidacies, which took to one step after the other one. On election day, we came out to the situation where some of the people that were part of the election and there's no ballot because we have electronic voting, but they were part of the election could be not occupying the seat because there's still questioning process going on. So that's something that was originated in a way in the legislation, and that's why I think it's very important to highlight that aspect. Also, in El Salvador, electoral reforms in the past years are consequences of sentences from the Supreme Court. The constitutional bench of that Supreme Court has been the most active entity in determining the scope of the elections law, the powers that it has arrogated, and this is a conclusion that we came up in the last electoral mission and in the previous one in 2015. The powers that it has arrogated to itself to make these decisions have in some cases gone beyond the constitutional review. And these implications and effects of these decisions have not necessarily been positive for the system. It is important and very important that legislative assemblies exercise their functions and discuss, agree in the political arena these electoral reforms that need to continue, specifically in El Salvador. Regarding electoral organization, as I mentioned, many countries have overcome issues related to this. Actions, logistics that are needed to organize an election are really complex and detailed. And some countries still struggle to have a more clean voters list. Staffing polling stations, we have seen it became an issue. For example, in Costa Rica, where democracy is very solid and people trust in the system, there was a big number of poll workers that didn't show up on election day. And that puts a lot of strain on the electoral management body to fill those gaps. But not only that, because of their legislation, they have to recount all those tables. So there is areas of improvement in that aspect in Costa Rica. In Paraguay, for example, what happened in the past election is that there's now not only political parties, but political alliances. And what happens is that the legislation that establishes how to conform those polling stations is prior to the one that regulates political alliances. So this situation created tensions, disparity in how those polling places were conformed, and obviously it had an impact on the trust, and it created a complicated situation for the tribunal and for the political climate before election day. Implementation of new technologies, that is an issue that it's really key and important also in building trust in the electoral process. There's a rapid development of ICTs. This is information and communication technology that presents opportunities to improve, strengthen, and modernize the electoral processes. The degrees of technology utilized in elections varies from country to country in the region, but efforts are being made to modernize processes throughout the electoral cycle. The successful implementation of the technologies depends largely in the ability of electoral management bodies to identify existing technologies that will create a solution and not build a bigger problem. And for that, they need to involve all the stakeholders, government officials, legislators, candidates, and citizens. And obviously, money and time also take a very important role on how these technologies are implemented in a successful way. In the region, the aspect that takes mostly all the attention regarding the use of technology is when we do the counting and the transmission of results. That's an area that usually gets questions from different political actors, and it demands a lot of attention and good communication strategies also from the electoral authorities. Because when something happens on election day, the first allegations are usually fraud, hackers, attacks, but sometimes it has to do more with lack of planning, with situations that have to do with also communications, and also they will put a high pressure on the electoral management bodies because tensions are high. Everybody wants to know if they won or not in the election. So there's usually questionings from some parties to the EMBs on how things go on in the election in El Salvador. We observed that the EMB, the tribunal, really worked hard and got past very difficult situation that they experienced in 2015, and on the night of the election, they had results. But they have a very complicated system to count members of the assembly. So the morning after the election, when these results for preferential vote came out, the system went bad. They put on top people that was not on top and bottom, so political parties realized that. And the tribunal and the company that was helping them and it was hired to perform this tax came out and they tackled the situation. They communicate well with the constituencies, and they avoided escalation. So it was a situation, it's still a challenge in some countries, but they could avoid and they took the measures to avoid escalation. In Colombia, prior to the election, the system of transmission of results was very questioned. And what the electoral management body did to counterpart that was giving political parties more tools to control this process, because it's very important that political parties are involved in every step of the electoral process, particularly when we talk about the publication of results, the consolidation of those results. As a department, we believe that it's very important that electoral authorities and party representatives have spaces where they can have mutual collaboration and dialogue, which can help build this confidence that we know we need. Electoral and campaigns was another thing that came up earlier in the conference, and these campaigns are taking place in this environment of disenchantment with democracy. In 2018, we mostly saw that levels of polarization and aggression in the campaigns have risen. These aggressions were not only directed towards candidates or electoral authorities, journalists were also targets and supporters. The situation was evident in many countries. In Ecuador, there were two very strong political views regarding the referendum. Even in Costa Rica, where the mission expressed concern about the rhetoric that permeated that campaign. And that happened in the context of a resolution from the Inter-American Human Rights Court regarding gender equality and non-discrimination. So polarization is something that in one way or another came up during the campaigns. Unfortunately, this verbal violence in some cases turned into physical violence. The example of Brazil, I think that was news, who's the actual elected president of Brazil was attacked before the first round of the election, and that took him out of the campaign and could not participate before the first round. And also in Mexico, that was also mentioned. It was a very violent election. The mission lamented it, and I think everybody did. And in the country, electoral authorities, as government authorities, were very concerned about the situation, and they took some actions that, in one way or another, were designed to prevent that this escalated the most. But it's true that it's something that it's not a norm in our region. And related to the campaign, what it came up as, and it's coming up more and more, and it's a challenge for us that we observe elections, is the use of social networks. This has been increasing because obviously communications and the levels of penetration of the internet are higher and higher. So obviously they have a higher impact. When this started, we all thought about the democratizing space that this network create, because they build this like one-on-one conversation among political parties with their constituencies, electoral institutions with their citizens, and we don't have, you don't have the media in between. But what happens is how we use this very powerful tool, and that's where comes this dilemma. The internet and social networks can be used by anyone, anywhere, and we've been seeing more and more, and probably lately in Mexico and Brazil, how they were used to be part of this attacks and spread of fake news. As it is news to us, it also news to the electoral authorities, which have been working with the media, universities, NGOs to try to create tools to counteract this situation. In Brazil, it was very specific because, yes, WhatsApp was used more than we guess, we don't know, but we guess ever before as a tool to disseminate fake news. And what happens with that is that it's a private space, so it's much more difficult to control, and it's much more difficult to know what's going on. And it was a challenge. In this case in Brazil, different actors reacted positively to the efforts to counteract this news. The tribunal had a special webpage dedicated to counteract fake news. Also, the company WhatsApp launched a digital literacy campaign to raise awareness about this. But obviously, this is a new topic, and we cannot be certain on what's in this media, what is constructive and what is not. It's difficult to have a clear picture yet on that. So we have to keep on working, and we will have to keep on working on developing tools to observe this, because we observe it as a phenomenon. We're finding out what institutions are doing, but also for the missions, it's a challenge on how to observe what happens in social media. We also mentioned corruption scandals that the region is facing. And that's very related to political financing and the context of the elections, because it comes to this feeling of the citizens on the bad relationship between money and politics, and we forget that money and politics need to coexist in a way. Money is important for electoral campaigns and for electoral processes. There's many different challenges in the region regarding the systems and how this is managed. It varies country by country, and in Latin America we can say that the challenges that are faced regarding political financing are as many countries we have, because obviously they all have different systems and they all come from different backgrounds. The biggest difference I will be between what happens in Caribbean and Latin America. In Caribbean countries, there's barely no regulation regarding the use of money in the context of politics and political campaigns. And Latin America has a different range of how countries have mixed systems where both public and private political financing coexists. Just a few don't have, and then the different measures of controlling this. In Grenada, for instance, this year, we observed this. We observed there's no specific legislation, no regulation directly to address the issue of campaign financing in any way. There's no public funding, so everything is funded through private funds. The origin of private funds, it's not regulated. There's no prohibitions for foreign or anonymous sources, and there are no limits on campaign spending, and political parties are not required to disclose their financings. But as I mentioned, this is not only the situation in Grenada. In Latin America, there's some issues related to access to this money and some other issues related to transparency and accountability and control of this. And I will go back to Costa Rica, that has a very interesting way of dispersing money for campaigns. They have public funds, but it's a reimbursement. So political parties get a small amount of money before the campaign, and then they get reimbursed. And how do they get the credits? They do it through private banks that take into consideration electoral polls. So if you're doing good in an electoral poll, you will get more money. And what happens is that the actual president of Costa Rica was really low in the numbers of electoral polls at the beginning of the election. So those tools are tools, but don't tell you how or who can get money in order to foster a campaign. So it could be challenging in some countries to be a candidate. On the other hand, there's other countries like Mexico that have a very robust system, not only in the amount of money that political parties receive, but also in the control system that we have. Institutions are strong, and there's accountability regarding the expenditures of the of what happens in campaigns, even though there's still room for improvement, because what we observed in this election is that many political parties did not report on time because sanctions might not be that sufficiently punitive to incentive them to present these reports. So obviously there's some room over there for improvement. In El Salvador and Paraguay, electoral authorities don't get enough human and financial resources in order to control. So missions usually in these cases recommend to strengthen these institutions to have more transparent systems. Clearly, political financing is a complex issue in which expectations and responsibilities should not only be put on the electoral authorities. Different state agencies, the media, civil society, and political parties must contribute so we have more equitable and transparent systems. I know you will be talking about this, I think, tomorrow, so you'll probably go deeper on these ideas. We also observe the participation of women in elections, and I think that panel comes right after or this afternoon at some moment. And what we've seen in Latin America since the 90s is that countries have adopted affirmative actions, what we call quotas, that have promoted women in public office. These measures gain acceptance in Latin America as a necessary strategy to ensure the inclusion of women in public decision-making spaces. The result of the implementation of this kind of measures contributed to where we are today. According to UPI, 29.5% of legislators in the region, in the national level, in the Americas are women. We are ranked at the second region of the world after the Nordic countries. So there's a lot of progress that's been done. Countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Mexico have approved legal reforms requiring parity in the candidacies. However, other countries like Guatemala and Venezuela do not have regulations to provide a quota or a measure to improve women participation. In the Caribbean, the only country, as far as I know, that has a quota is Guyana, and I think it's a 30% quota, and this is considering the lists that that political parties present for the election, not considering internal elections or internal democracy. We have observed in 2018 mixed results in this issue in countries such as Costa Rica and Mexico that have a legislation and institutions that enforce them. We saw considerable increase in women public positions. In Costa Rica, after these elections, 45.6 elections comprised the assembly compared to 33.3 on the previous one, and in Mexico, the Chamber of Deputies has 48.2 and the Senate 49.22, so it's great numbers. In other cases, like Grenada, we have almost 50% of women in their parliament. This was due more to an internal decision of the political party that won the election that decided to go with high levels of women in their list. But it's not something that it's regulated. And in that case, the mission recommended that Grenada consider introducing these temporary legal measures in order to improve the accessibility of women to electoral positions. In El Salvador, Colombia, and Brazil, that have quota laws, we experienced that they were, in some cases, like El Salvador, it's like 31% of women in the assembly. So we're like just right there. There was not a much more increase than what the quota established. In Colombia, unfortunately, the lower chamber has 18% of women compared to 20. It's not a big decrease, but it's not an advance, and we're looking for that. That's the idea of this, and the same very small variation happened in Paraguay. Brazil is still struggling a little more to get more women in seats. They only have 15% after this last election. It's more than they had before, so we congratulate that, but there's still work to be done to improve not only the measures that give access to women, but also how they're implemented and how political parties work with them in order to comply with the spirit of the quota. In some, the gap between formal recognition of women political rights and the exercise of them persists in some of the countries. I just would like to say that access is not enough. With more and more women in the political arena, we have been that conditions on how they participate are also very important. Political violence have arisen, and we've seen this tendency again, like with social media. Electoral management bodies and legislations are working to, in a way, stop this trend and to counteract this reaction. But it's a challenge that we've seen, and also the political financing. It's another one of the conditions that that make more difficult for women to access to public spaces. The good news again, and I try always to bring back, like, this is a situation, but things are happening and changes are happening. In Brazil, there is direct and indirect political financing directed to women, 30%. And this was due to legislation, but also because of the work of the tribunal and of decisions of the tribunal. Mexico has, institutions have worked highly to contain political violence against women. And now there's legislation in the local level in order to counteract this. We also observe participation of indigenous and Afro-descendant groups. Unfortunately, there is not much information, official data, in order to understand this better, because rates of the institutions don't have in their voters registry a category that will allow us to identify them. But from the missions that we deployed and the experts, we know that there's low participation, and that is also reflected in candidacies and electoral election post. Mexico has a quota. Colombia also has specific constituencies for indigenous and Afro-descendant groups. So some measures are coming in order to increase their participation. So just in summary, electoral processes in the Americas are evolving at different paces. They still present some basic challenges, but at the same time, they face more complex and new ones, such as the use of social media to attack and discredit opponents and authorities, or to undermine the election. It is difficult for me to sum up this long year of deployments. We had, as I mentioned, 12 missions that generated a big amount of information, but I hope that I've shared enough that can help the discussions that we're going to have later. I would like to invite you to access our online database. All the information, all the reports that we produce are online, and you can get formal reports, you can get recommendations by topic, you can see the results of the forms that our observers produce. So because you're in the academia and you're interested in studies, I think that's a valuable tool that you can take advantage of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We see the wisdom of naming this panel Electoral Marathon 2018. So we have 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll be keeping a queue. Ma'am?
Thank you very much. A great summary. You mentioned
Sir.
You mentioned the authorities' reactions to certain problems or related to polling stations or probably legislation or a violence context or whatever. So I think that's important, how to take into account for an evaluation the authorities' response if they act punctually and timely to solve the problem. Because unfortunately we are also facing electoral problems created on purpose. Probably because opposition knows that they could lose in a constituency or in an area, and they prefer to get the annulment of the election than to lose, and they fire the ballot boxes or organize public demonstrations and threaten voters, etc. So the reactions of authorities are essential. Do you evaluate the timely reactions and participation of authorities in these cases? I think that's important for evaluation, such as Professor Norris presented before us, if they take into account this.
Yes, we do. And actually, most of the things that I mentioned are part of our reports. We take into consideration what are the measures that electoral management bodies take. It was in Colombia, they improved this way. In Mexico, they did this or that. Like, really, it's important for us because our reports are more than in a spirit of evaluation, it's an analysis. And our job as an international organization is to support our member states. Electoral observation missions are independent. We work in a different framework than other observers or other people that observe what happens in an election, but we want to contribute. And noting that there's good experiences here, good experiences there, we can help other countries to take from them and to build on them. For example, Jamaica, that had elections years ago, had a political ombudsman. The last election was 2015. So we rescue that practice as a good practice. And sometimes when we are in forums and we are in interactions with electoral management bodies, what we try to do is bring those practices together so they can also use them and improve, yeah.
Ben?
Thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit about constraints that affect OAS election observer missions? So whether it be invitations or timely invitations, or how a mission might get funded or not sufficiently funded. You know, what are the constraints that shape missions? When do you get a mission that has the capacity to observe, say, Afro-descendant or indigenous participation or gender balance? What's affecting the nature of the missions?
Thank you for the question. Electoral observation missions are deployed to the request of the member states. So we get invitations from the member states, and when we get those invitations, we start fundraising. So basically, just a small, very, very tiny part of our program is funded by the regular fund of the organization. So the size sometimes of our missions depend on the amount of funding that we have. Our program has 21 countries that fund it, but this type of activity, because all our observers and experts are international, can become expensive. There's a lot of travel going on. So obviously that it's another important constraint for us, which is, and because, the support to this type of programs, like Dr. Norris was mentioning, has lowered in the past years. Obviously there's concern. There's a lot of work that we are doing continuously with donors to increase this funding. Another thing that it's very important to understand is that even though we get invited by the member states, we have two different type of agreements that they sign with us that allow us to be independent, objective, and not have constraints to our work on what we say or what we do. There's one that has to do with immunities and privileges that only cover our work. It's not like a full diplomatic one, but regarding our work, we have that protection. And also we have another one that we call the procedures agreement, that we work with the electoral management body and we get full access to the whole process. So if we need to get all the information regarding the voting results and we need to have a copy, or being allowed to be in specific places where voting results are coming in, and obviously not everybody can be there. It's not the full mission. It's one technical person because it's a very specific place that cannot, be crowded and manages very sensitive information. So, but we can have an expert there. So yes, those agreements protect the mission and allow it to do its work freely. And obviously, it's included that we can make statements to the public, and our reports are presented first in the country to the public, and the electoral authorities get it at the same time as the public is receiving it. And then we get another report that is presented to the Permanent Council of the organization. So we present it to all our ambassadors there, and that's another way of accountability for us.
Thank you. We have time for a last question, Professor Peju.
Thank you. My question is less about the logistical aspects, but goes to this very interesting dynamic in your talk between, on the one hand, having a sense in which particular frameworks are being respected or implemented, and at the same time, this way of reaching for experimentation, finding out interesting practices, which then can be spread out by way of best practices. So the example of the political ombudsman is one, and then in that framework, I was wondering if there is anything. This might be going beyond the specific sort of mandate that you have, but regarding things such as political debates. So we're all very concerned about the role of social media. We're all very concerned about the way in which these information bubbles are completely self-referential. Have you encountered any places where say public funding of elections comes with obligations of the candidates to debate, to show up and debate each other in public? The Brazil example came to me with Bolsonaro didn't show up. I mean, he had objective reasons for not doing it, at least, from the first round. But if you take a place like France, maybe Marine Le Pen would have had more votes had she not been forced to debate Macron. So you have a sense in which, bring the candidates to debate each other in public, maybe more than once, and then as a way of making the bubbles burst, and of relying on this long-standing principle of how democracies get to where they are, which is some belief in deliberation, and in the idea of deliberative democracy. So I just wonder if there is anything at the level of existing practices which can then be recommended as best practices, and they can then become part of soft regulation, which can become harder or hardened. Should there be either international pressure of the kind that you can apply, or should there be political will on the part of the national representatives?
There's no standard of on who, like if debates or no debates. Along missions, we promoted debates, and we promote the idea of not the concept of a TV debate, but the idea of exchange of platforms, exchange of ideas. But obviously, we respect if a candidate does not want to be part of that, because at the end, the constituency will judge them for that decision or not. We don't have, I don't know, and there's other regional experts here that might help me, any country that obligates a candidate to debate in a situation because they're receiving public funding. I don't know of any case in our region that has that. I'm not sure. And I'm a journalist, so freedom of expression and I think there's some freedoms, but I don't know. It's a personal opinion. We don't have a standard for that. And basically, what our missions do and recommend have to do with they started with international standards. As Dr. Norris mentioned, they built their system on the international standards agreements that our countries decided that were good and necessary, and our missions, in the very different way of working on it, we do have the same. So there's no standard on that. I might have a personal opinion, but there's not a standard that we can say, oh, you should force. What happens in the region is the other way. There's countries where there's a lot of candidates, and TV stations don't want to have an 11 people debate because it doesn't end up to be a debate. It becomes something else, or time, or the dynamics of television are very difficult to put together with the amount of candidates. So we had cases the other way around where we recommend that they are allowed to participate. But I don't think there's any standard regarding that.
So reluctantly, I will bring this to a close. There is a good tradition here in this country, Brenda, as you know, of thanking people for their public service. So I would like to thank you for your public service, and I ask that you all thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Santa Maria. I think it's very important, this broad perspective of the electoral marathon in Latin America, and the point of view of the OAS is central. I want to notice also that Professor Miguel Ángel Lara, who was supposed to be in this panel, could not come, had a medical problem in coming here, so he could not be here, but he sent his presentation, and we have copies here for anyone who is interested. Thank you, of course, Professor Barros, for joining us, and I invite the speakers of the third panel on to the podium, and we can